Hi everyone, this is Ravi. Welcome to Katalon Automation tutorial. As you all know, I've already published 37 YouTube videos covering beginners to the advanced level concepts. This is our lesson 38. Please do subscribe to the channel, click on bell icon, you'll receive notifications whenever I publish more videos. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about dynamic test objects. I'm going to teach you how can we parameterize the dynamic web test objects by using Katalon Studio. As part of this lesson, I'm going to cover three different chapters. The first chapter, Introduction to Dynamic Objects and the Parameterization. As part of this chapter, we are going to talk about what is dynamic objects in automation and what are the different strategies to handle dynamic objects, and we are going to understand the scenarios where we can apply the parameterization by using Katalon Studio. And in chapter 2, I'm going to start teaching you how can you parameterize web test objects in Katalon Studio. As part of this chapter 2, first we are going to discuss about how to parameterize the web test objects and their properties using local variables, and then how can you parameterize web test objects and their properties using global variable, and then how can you parameterize web test objects using multiple parameters. And in chapter 3, I'm going to teach you the different best practices in parameterizing the web test objects. This is our chapter 1, Introduction to Dynamic Objects and Parameterization. As part of section 1 in chapter 1, let us first understand what is dynamic objects in automation.
A lot of times when we automate a feature and run it for the first time, generally it gives us a green results as passed. However, when you are running for the second time, it gives us several failures with the exact same code. And after further analysis, we get to know that web elements we are dealing with are dynamic in nature, and it becomes quite challenging to interact with such dynamic elements. So now, what is dynamic elements? The dynamic elements in automation refer to the elements on a web page with attributes or properties that can change dynamically during runtime. So these elements may have varying IDs, classes, names, or other attributes that are not static and may change each time the page is loaded or updated. So the dynamic element is that web element whose IDs and any other attributes like class name, value, etc. are not fixed. So it changes every time you reload the page. So you cannot handle that element simply by the exact value of any locator. For example, you have a Gmail inbox, right? So the Gmail inbox elements, their class name gets changed on every login because the number of emails are not static. So the class name gets changed whenever there is a change in the number of emails in the inbox. So dynamic elements are database driven or session driven. So when you edit an element in database, it changes a number of areas of application under test. So dynamic elements are strictly content with formatting being laid out in the design. Dynamic identifiers are generally used for text boxes or buttons. If you are automating a dynamic website, the scripts will break as soon as the content changes, which will cause your test to fail. Then you have to update your test case each and every time, which is a tiresome task and not a generic solution at all. So what is the solution? We always need to understand the behavior of these elements as the page is reloaded or entered into the new session. So once we understand it, we can derive a strategy to interact with these elements.
As part of section 2 in chapter 1, you will learn what are the different strategies to handle dynamic objects. So before we proceed, let me give you a quick information. So there is another course in Katalon Academy where it talks in detail about the strategies to handle the web elements by using Katalon Studio. But in this session, I'm going to focus on strategies to handle only dynamic objects.
So these are some of the strategies that are listed below. Okay. So let's see a dynamic element example with the tag as button, which has a dynamic ID and a class name. So where the ID is getting changed from, if you see here, it is changing from first value to the second value. The difference is the last digit is changed from 1 to 2. That means the last digit is a variable. So basically it is a dynamic. And the class name is getting changed from text 45 to text 73. Here last two digits are dynamic. Okay, so now how can we handle this kind of dynamic objects? Let us see different strategies. So first strategy is relative XPath with starting text. So this is a partial link selector. So we can also use XPath search with starting text match element. We can apply starts with function to access the element as shown below. So because your button is a dynamic and your button ID starts with ID. So what I'm saying here, /button, and I'm specifying it as starts with @ID. That means I want to see ID. Okay, so the ID property starts with ID hyphen. So here the dynamic portion is being handled by using starts with method.
Now, let us see an example by using Katalon Studio. How can we handle dynamic objects using starts with method? So this is my Katalon. Let us first create one test case. I'm going to create a test case called dynamic objects handling. And now to save the time, I would like to use web recording. Click on record web. As usual, we are gonna record the application by using the Cura Healthcare provided by Katalon. And now click on record. I'm gonna automate a very small functionality called login by using Katalon. Click on make appointment, provide username, and then provide the password. And then click on login. So now my recording is completed. I'm gonna stop the recording. And I would like to save the script. I'm gonna simply save the script and then I'm gonna override the objects by using the existing repository. Done. So now our automation of login functionality is done. So now to understand the object properties, if you see here, let me go to the username object. Okay, this is my username object. This has been identified by an XPath and it is using ID property, correct? In the same way, password also using ID property within the XPath. Now, what if this ID property is changed. If this ID property changes, what happens? So let me see now. Okay, let's close this. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna introduce a breakpoint. To introduce a breakpoint, you need to go to script view and you need to double click in front of the step where you want to introduce the breakpoint. So I want to introduce the breakpoint after clicking on make appointment button. Right, this is my make appointment step. So I want to introduce here. So double click here. So as soon as you double click, a small breakpoint will be introduced here. That means now we introduced a breakpoint. Now let's go to manual again. I want to run the script in debug mode, because if I run the script in debug mode, then the script execution will be paused at a breakpoint. So click on debug. So this opened your Cura Healthcare. Now it is asking, do you want to switch to the debug mode? Yes, I would like to switch. So now I'm going to click on make appointment button and see, if you see here, it's already clicked on make appointment button. Now it's paused at breakpoint. Let's go to manual step. Now what I'm going to do, I want to put this aside. So now what I'll do, I would like to change the property of username. Let's assume the developers changed the property of username. Okay, let's go to inspect, and here I would like to change the property called ID property. So ID property is text hyphen username. Now I would like to change it to text hyphen username 123. In the same way, I would like to change the ID property of password as well. Let's change it to text hyphen password 123. So done. So what if I run the script now from here onwards, then what happens? Stop the script. What I'm going to do, I want to run from entering the username, password, and then right click and click on run from here. We'll see what happens. The script will fail because the ID property got changed. So hence, Katalon will not be able to identify the username and password. So let's see what happens. It is unable to identify. Now, if you see here, it's actually the script has been stopped. It is failed. Why? Because it is unable to find the object, unable to set the text of corresponding object. Now, I want to make this work even though the ID property changed, because the property of the ID is changed by introducing 123 at the end, but there is a portion, static portion and the dynamic portion, right? So I want to make it work. How? Let's go back to our Katalon script and right click on this particular object, open the object. Now here I want to introduce start with method. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to say starts with ID comma. Here I'm going to say, let's say I'll take just user. What I'm saying, double slash double forward slash input starts with ID, should start with text hyphen user. So now let's save this. In the same way, let us modify password as well. Right click, open the password, and here I'm going to say starts with, open the bracket, ID comma, and it should start with txt-pass and close the bracket. And now save this as well. If I run the test now, it should be successful. So I'm going to run from here only. Let's put this aside so that you can see clearly whether it's going to run properly. Change the property of username to 123, and also we change the property of password to 123. We introduced additional character. So now let us run from the same step and see if it handles the username and password entry in the text box. Now it should enter the username and password successfully. See, it entered the username and password and clicked on login. That means whatever the properties that we changed, or whatever the method that we are using starts with method or username and password, those are working correctly.
Let us see our second method, relative XPath with following or preceding nodes. So basically the following includes all nodes that follow the content node. We can apply following to specify the following elements in the web element list. Let us see here. So by using following and preceding node, we can handle dynamic objects. If you see in the example, XPath equal to // button contains the class id hyphen class. I'm not specifying this dynamic text. This button is followed by what? This button is under a tag called input. So following input contains the id hyphen. Okay. In the same way, you can use preceding also. In preceding, first you are going to use the input tag preceding your actual button. Here, in both the cases, we are using following and preceding methods. And then our next method is relative XPath with text contains. Simple. So what I'm going to do, XPath equal to // button that contains a class. So this class contains what? Part of your class value, which is class. And next method is multiple attribute. Basically, you can use multiple attributes to identify the dynamic objects. And the last method is, which is a very important method, parameterize web test objects in Katalon Studio. So with parameterizing test objects, you can update test objects locators dynamically by using either local variables or global variables. So this feature comes in handy in these use cases. So now let us explore more about parameterize web test objects in Katalon Studio.
As part of section 3 in chapter 1, let us first understand the different scenarios where we can apply parameterization. First example, okay, so there are some cases in which you can identify an object's locator only during runtime. So in other words, the exact locator of the intended object cannot be specified beforehand in test scripts. So let us see an example of Cura Healthcare Center appointment web page. For instance, so if you see on the screen, there are three options of healthcare program. One is Medicare, Medicaid, none, right? So these three options, the selected one is only known with the passing data during execution. So which option to be selected, that you are going to decide during execution by passing the data. How can we specify an option in the test script? By parameterizing its locator. So you need to create only one test object, and you can determine which exact object is with the passed data during test execution. That means you'll be creating only one test object for these three radio buttons, and you're going to pass the test data to satisfy those three radio buttons. So how? Let us see now. Now for the exciting part, how do you determine which attribute you have to adjust to parameterize this object's XPath? So the answer to this question is mainly based on your knowledge of the web application under test. You need to know the pattern of how similar objects are grouped is the key. So in this case, the index values of label attribute is the value to parameterize for options on the current web screen. If you see here, Medicare has an ID, right? This is the ID where the label, if you see the label attribute is changing. The rest all constant, but the label attribute is changing with the increment number 1, 2, 3. So in this case, the indexes value of label attribute is the value to parameterize. So we need to parameterize these indexes of label attribute. Correct? So depending upon your preferred selection method. What are the preferred selection methods? Either XPath, attribute or CSS. The captured object has a corresponding selected locator. So below steps are how to apply parameterizing test objects in this case. What we are going to do? We are going to capture XPath locator of these three options. What these options? The radio buttons, what we are talking about. We are going to capture the XPath of these three options, analyze the pattern of these XPaths, and we understand that the index value need to be parameterized for this label attribute. So now once you identify, then we can start parameterizing the index values. So now let us see the second example. In the Amazon web page, for instance, there are search results and the selected one is only known with the passing data during execution. Let's say I'm searching laptops. Now, which link do I need to click? That only can be identified while running your tests and by passing the data. Okay, so how can we do that? So in this case, indexes value of div attribute is the value to parameterize for options on the current web screen. If you see here, these are the indexes. If you see the div, this is your first link. This is your second link. If you see the div index is changing 3 and 4. That means you need to parameterize the index of your div attribute. Correct? You need to parameterize the index value of div attribute. So you need to capture the XPath locator of these search results and then save them into the repository, and you're going to keep only one object, and then we are going to parameterize the index. So hope you all understand what are all the different scenarios where we can apply the parameterization of the object. This is our chapter 2 where we will learn how can we parameterize web test objects in Katalon Studio. As part of section 1 in chapter 2, let us see first how can we parameterize web test objects and their properties using local variables. So with parameterizing test objects, you can update test objects locators dynamically by using either local variables or global variables. So first, let me cover local variables. So Katalon Studio supports parameterizing properties of test objects to handle dynamic objects. As we discussed, dynamic objects are those that we have some particular changes in their properties based on specific business rules. So as I told you earlier, you can parameterize test objects with different selection methods, attributes, XPath and CSS location. So now we are going to see an example describes how to apply this feature by using Katalon Cura Healthcare application. So let us see first what are all the steps that we need to follow to parameterize the test objects. First, you need to identify the test objects that can be parameterized. You cannot parameterize any object you want, right? First, you need to identify the suitable test object that can be parameterized. And then you need to create parameterized test object. And then we need to create variables that will supply values to the parameter during runtime. And then we need to automate the test case using Katalon Studio by using above created parameterized test object and the variables that we defined. So now let us jump onto the system and see an example. How can we parameterize web test object by using local variables in Katalon Studio? What is our first step? Our first step is identify the test objects that can be parameterized. So let us first go to our Cura Healthcare application. Okay. So let me log into Cura Healthcare application by using the test credentials provided by Katalon. And if you see here, these are the 3 radio buttons. I have identified these 3 objects to be parameterized. Why? Let's go here. You see here, my first Medicare radio button starts with ID appointment and ends with label 1. And then my Medicaid radio button starts with ID appointment, ends with label 2. And none starts with ID appointment, ends with label 3. So in this case, instead of adding 3 objects, I can add only 1 object, and what radio button to be selected that I'm going to decide during runtime. Right? So now I can parameterize these objects. How? I can replace these constants with a variable. So now we identified a test object that can be parameterized. What is our next step? Our next step is create parameterized object. So you need to create the parameterized object in Katalon Studio. Let us go to Katalon Studio. So this is my Katalon Studio. Under object repository, let me create a folder called Parameterized. Under this folder, I'll create a new object, test object called radio button. So here I would like to define attribute. What is the attribute value? I would like to take this one of the attribute value. Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to add object property. What is the name of property I would like to add? I would like to add XPath. As soon as I type the attribute name, it pre-populates. And what is the value? My value is this one. Paste it here. Click on OK and then click on detect object here. As soon as you click on detect object, what happens? Your selected locator is this. Now, instead of using this label 1, I would like to replace that constant with my variable. How can we do that? Here, instead of 1, delete this, dollar, open curly braces, index is my variable, close curly braces. That's it. That means I'm replacing with 1 with variable called index. Variable is denoted with dollar symbol. So if you see, now your object locator has been changed like this. That means we have parameterized your object by using a variable. So now we have completed creating parameterized test object. So now what is our next? Our next step is create variables that will supply values to parameterized object. So now I need to supply values to this index, right? So for that, let's go back to our test cases. I need to first create test case. Right click on test case and then create a folder called parameter. Okay, what I'm going to do? Parameterize. And then I'm going to create one test case. This is my test case. I call it as cc underscore parameterized object. Okay, I'm calling this test case as parameterized object. Now we need to define the variable now. So here, this is your test case. We are in manual tab. Go to variable tab, and here under variable tab, create a variable by clicking on add. What is the variable that you would like to create? I would like to create a variable called index, correct? So here, let's create index as a variable. Now, what is this index type? This is my number. The type of index is number. Let me put the default value as 1 because my first object is 1, 2, 3. Okay, for now I'm just hard coding it as 1. What is this variable? This variable is called local variable. I have defined the local variable. Now I'm parameterizing this local variable, parameterizing the object by using local variable. So now let us go back to manual tab. Now let me create a test case now. First, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add try finally statement. Okay, go to exception handling, click on try statement with finally. The main intention of this course is parameterization. So I would recommend you guys to ignore the conditional statements like try finally, and then I'm going to use for conditional loop as well. So you can ignore these two concepts for this particular course. So you can find a separate course in Katalon Academy covering different concepts of conditional statements. So here under finally, I'm going to add a web UI keyword called close browser. I'm closing browser. Under try statement, instead of adding the steps one by one, I want to record a quick session. Okay, what I'm going to do, let's close this. Use web recording. Do you want to continue recording test case? Yes, I want to continue recording test case. And here, click on record. As soon as you click on record, it will open your Cura application. So quickly, I'm going to create a script. Click on login. Enter your username. Enter password. Okay, click on login, right? That's it. That's what I want to do. Now let us stop recording. So now I want to save this script. Let's save the script. I want to save all the objects under parameterized folder that we just now created. Click OK. It is asking, do you want to append or override? Let me override current test case. Okay. So if you see here under final, so what happened? Whatever the recorded script, that is appended here, right? I want to do one thing because we already have close browser under final statement. I want to delete this step and rest all the steps. I want to take these to try statement. I am dumping them into try statement. Try opening the browser. Navigate to URL and then provide login credential. Click on login button. Once you click on login button, you need to select the radio button that is required. So the selection of radio button is dynamic. I don't want to define too early in the script, right? So for that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert a loop statement after login. What I'm going to do, right click, insert after looping statement, for loop statement. And here, let us define the index for loop statement. One thing you need to keep in mind, so the index whatever we are defining in for loop, that is different from the variable name where we named it as index. So you can name the variable whatever you want. Okay, so the index variable name is different from the index which we are using in for loop. It starts from 1, it ends at 3 because we have 3 radio buttons. Click OK, click OK. Now under for loop, I would like to select the radio button, right? What I need to do, I need to select the radio button. For that, what I'm going to do, right click and add a web UI keyword. What keyword? I'm going to add click. What I need to click? I need to click this radio button, right? For that, double click here and select the radio button that we parameterized. Here, this one. As soon as you select the radio button that we parameterized, it is asking you to provide the variables because we already created variables, right? I can use this variable there. Again, go here and then parameterized radio button here. Add your variable. This is string. Parameter type is string. And what is the parameter? Index. And this is a variable. This parameter is variable. And now whatever the local variable that we define, you can select directly from here. So you're able to add the variable that we defined earlier to the object which we parameterized. Click on OK. So now see, because it is a for loop, my first index starts with 1, comes here, and here the index is being replaced with 1. Now I want to increase the value from 1 to 2. How can I do? I can insert binary statement. Right click and then add binary statement. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to say left expression is variable. Let me call my variable called index here, right? And here, what is the operator? Increment operator. What is the increment operator? Plus or equal. This is your increment operator. And what is the number? I want to increment by 1. Click on OK. So this, what it will do? It opens the browser. Once you log into the healthcare, Cura Healthcare, let's log in, copy this, login. See, once login, what it will do? It first, the index will come as 1. That 1 index will be passed to this button here, number 1. So that means it's going to select Medicare. And then it comes back here. It again increases the index by 1. Now it comes as 2. It will select Medicaid. And then again it goes back by increasing one number 1, right? It comes as 3. So now it selects none. So that means by using one object, parameterized object, we are selecting 3 different objects. We are selecting 3 different controls, right? So now let us save this and run this and see what happens. Okay, before run, let's close this. Okay, close this. So let's run this. So observe closely, it might be too fast where it selects all 3 radio buttons as soon as you log in. It opens your web browser. So it clicks on login. See here now. So now it selected all 3 radio buttons by using only one parameterized object. You can see here. Let's see the results. Under under for loop, you can see here, this is my for loop. First index went as 1. It clicked on the object, right? Medicare. And then second time it clicked on next radio button. Third time it clicked on another radio button. Finally, it closed the browser. Hope you all understand how can you parameterize the object by using local variable. As part of section 2 in chapter 2, you will learn how can we parameterize web test objects and their properties using global variables. So let us first understand what is the difference between local variable and global variable. So the local variable we have defined at test case level, and you can use that particular variable within the test case. Whereas global variables you can define at project profile level. So you'll be defining global variables at profile level, and these global variables can be used in n number of times in n number of test cases within the project. So let us see what are the steps to follow to parameterize the test objects. So as usual, we will be identifying the test objects that can be parameterized, and we need to create parameterized test object and then create global variables that will supply values to the parameter during runtime. And then we need to automate the test case using Katalon Studio by using above created parameterized test object and the global variable that we defined. So now let us jump onto the system and see how can we automate or how can we parameterize the test object by using global variables. So what is our first step? Our first step is identify test objects, right? So let us go to Chrome. I just want to identify the new test objects for this section. So what I'm going to do, let me inspect username here, okay? Let's right click and inspect. And when I inspect username, right, and I want to see the XPath. So this is the XPath. Let me copy this XPath, paste it here. So if you see, the XPath for the username is /s input @id equal to txt username. For XPath for password is same thing, but after hyphen it is password. That means username and password, we can consider these values as a dynamic. Now I can replace, if I want to parameterize this object, I can replace this text, right, with a variable. We can replace with a variable, correct? So that's what we are going to do. So now we have identified the objects that we need to parameterize. Now let us go back to Katalon. So first, what is our next step? Once we identify the objects, create parameterized test object. Let's go to Katalon Studio, and under object repository, under parameterized folder, I'm going to create a new object. Right click on new and click on test object. I'm going to name this as login fields. So basically these are the login text fields, right? Login text fields. Click OK. And here now I would like to add an attribute. Let's add the attribute. I want to add the attribute name XPath. Okay, it's gonna pre-populate. And then what is the value? The value is this one. Copy this, paste it here, and click on OK. And you need to check the checkbox detect object column. But here, instead of password, I want to replace this with a variable. How can we start variable? How can we replace? With dollar. Dollar, open curly braces, close curly braces. I'm going to specify this as field name, right? So done. So what we did, we have parameterized the object. So now let's save this test object. What is our next step? Our next step is create global variables that will supply values to the parameter during runtime. What we are going to do? To create global variables, you need to go to default. Under profile, click on default. As I told you earlier, so we are defining global variables at execution profile level. But whereas the local variables we defined at test case level. So what does these profile means? So basically for your project, you will have a multiple profiles. Example, if you want to define the global variables for a QA environment, you can create one profile. And if you want to create global variables for a production environment, you can create another profile and maintain all those global variables within that profile. And here, I'm going to create a global variable here. What I'm going to do? I'm going to create a global variable called field name, and this is string. I'm going to pass the default value as username, because if I want to type any text under username, the value should be username. If I want to type any text for password, the value should be password. So I am passing the value default value as username. Now let us create one new test case. Right click and click on new and test case. I'm going to name this as tc underscore global underscore parameterized. Done. So what I'm going to do, I would like to use the objects file, okay, to create the test case. What I'm going to do, I'll take PyWeb, click on this and start PyWeb, okay, start the browser. I would like to capture the make appointment button, correct? Right click and capture object, right? And I would like to capture another object called login button as well, right? And this, we already created one object for these two fields, correct? And then that's it. So now you need to save these objects. So if you want to save the objects, you can simply click on save. But however, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to save these objects, because earlier in our earlier section, we already added make appointment button as well as login button. So I'm going to reuse them. So now let us again, first let's start adding the steps. Web UI keyword. What is our first keyword? Open browser, right? And then I need to add a keyword navigate to URL. What is the URL? My URL is this one. This is the URL. Copy this and paste this URL as a URL string. And then you need to click on make appointment, right? So now add web UI keyword, click. And where is your make appointment? I already have object here. And simply drag and drop here. And then once you click on make appointment, you need to enter username password. But these two objects we already parameterized. This is the new object that we created, login text. Remember this, right? This is the login text where we already parameterized. So what I'm going to do, let's go back to your test case. Here I'm going to add one new keyword called set text. And what is the object? The newly created parameterized object. Drag this and drop it here. And now what is the text I want to set? I want to set the text as John Doe. Click OK. But now whenever you call the parameterized object, double click on this, you need to define your variables, right? The variable that we already added earlier. Okay, what I'm going to do, add variable. This is string. What is the parameter? Field name is the parameter. And what is the type? Here you need to select the value type as global variable. Value type as global variable. And now you can see all the global variables that we already defined in default under profile, right? So we just added field name. Select this. Click OK. So now again add another keyword. Again set text. So this time I'm setting a text for password, but I'm going to use the same field. Drag and drop here. Same parameterized field. What is the value? I'm going to pass it as just password underscore test. I'm passing the value password underscore test. Again here for this object you need to add the variable, right? Here field name is the parameter value, is the parameter, and what is the value type? Again here it's not local variable, it is global variable, and then call the global variable that we already defined. Click OK. So now if I run this particular test, what should happen? Because I'm passing the global variable or username, what it is going to do? What it will do? It passes copy. See what we did here. Here we actually defined a variable here, right? So it's going to pass username here. It's going to pass username here, right? That means both the fields, these both steps will enter the values in username only. Let's see now. Let's save this and run this particular test. It's going to open the browser and then navigate to Cura Healthcare. Done. So see here, it is entering John Doe and password test. Both of them are entered in username only. Correct? But let us say I want to change the field value or parameterization of the global variable in runtime. Now instead of username, I want to define this as password. Let's click OK and save this. See, I'm actually defining this during runtime. Just before running the test, I changed the global variable to password. So now what happens? Parameterized object will be replaced with password. Correct? So now let us close this and run the test again. Click on run. So now what happened? Now these two steps should enter the values in password field instead of username field. See now, so it entered the password, it entered the password. So that means these two steps taking the value from the global variable, right? Where are we defining the global variables? We are defining under profiles and default. So hope you all understand how can you parameterize your object by using global variables. As part of section 3 in chapter 2, you will learn how can we parameterize web test objects using multiple parameters. So now let us jump onto the system and see how can we parameterize web test objects using multiple parameters, unlike we did in section 1 and 2 using single parameter. Okay, so for that let's go to your Katalon. Okay, first let us identify what are the objects that you would like to parameterize. So I will be taking the same objects that we have considered for section 1. So I would recommend you guys to watch section 1 before you watch this section. So let's go to Katalon and see whatever the test case that we automated by using section 1, which is tc underscore parameterized object, right? I'm going to copy the same test case that we automated in section 1. Okay, copy this test case and then paste in the folder called Parameterize. So once you paste it, rename this as tc underscore multi-parameterization. So now let us enhance this test case to accommodate multiple parameters while parameterizing your web test object. So let's open this multi-parameterization test case. And here, so what we are going to do, so we already identified an object, right, which is radio buttons. So this is the object that I want to parameterize. But let us see in section 1, what we did, we have parameterized this object by using only one parameter with a variable called index. Now I want to use multiple parameters here. If you see here, under appointment, right, I want to replace this text also with a variable. How can I do? I can simply replace this with dollar. I want to replace this appointment with a variable. How can we do? You can just select that appointment, dollar. I want to replace with the variable called appoint. Okay, I want to replace with variable called appoint. Dollar, open curly braces, appoint, close curly braces. So that means now you can see your XPath is having two parameters, correct? First parameter here and your second parameter here. Save this. Now let us go back to our test case. Here, if you see under for loop, right, we already used this radio button selection. But now, as we have introduced a new variable, first we need to define the new variable. For that, you need to go to variables tab and here add a new variable called appoint variable, and this is your string. And what is the value? I want to put a value called appointment, the default value as appointment. Save this. Now let's go back to your test case. Here under multi-parameterization test case, let's go to manual tab. Here under radio buttons, now I want to add a new, I need to map the newly created variable. So here simply add string appoint and here select it as a variable, and now you should see the new variable that we created just now. The appoint is new variable. That means now this radio button object has been parameterized by using these two variables or these two parameters. Click on OK. Now save this. Okay, so let me repeat what we did. First, we have identified the objects that we want to parameterize 1, 2, 3 by using multiple parameters. These three objects, radio buttons, we have selected. And then for the radio button, whatever the radio button that we added earlier, now we have parameterized our XPath by introducing another parameter called appoint. Earlier, we already have one parameter called index, right? So now I parameterized another parameter with another variable. So now, then what we did, we went to our test case, we went to variables tab, we added the new variable called appoint, and we have allocated the default string. And we came back to manual, and here for the radio button in the test step, we have mapped the newly created variable. So now let us run this and see if we will be able to select all those three radio buttons by using these two parameters. So now let's save this and close your browser, right? And then run this test case. Okay, click on run. So now it should open your Cura website, Cura healthcare website, and then it should log in as usual by using the credentials provided by Katalon. Opened. Let me maximize this, and then it is logging in. You observe closely. See, Medicare, Medicaid, none. So it selected all three radio buttons by using only one object called radio button, but which is parameterized by using multiple parameters. Hope you all understand how can you parameterize the object by using multiple parameters. In chapter 3, you will learn what are all the best practices that we need to follow in parameterizing the web test objects. The first best practice, you need to determine which attributes you have to adjust to parameterize the object's XPath. Let's assume you are using XPath as your default locator. Now you need to understand within the XPath what attributes you have to adjust to parameterize the XPath. So that is one good best practice. And the next best practice, so based on your knowledge of the web application, it is very important to know the pattern of how similar objects are grouped to parameterize the web object. And then you need to prepend with / for escaping special characters while parameterizing the web objects. This is very important. What do you mean by that? So if you see here, in this particular statement here, okay, so basically what I'm talking here, we are actually in the script mode. Okay, in the script mode, this is how the code is. Okay, so if you observe this closely, here what I am parameterizing, I'm actually using some global variable called product name, right? Currency unit of this particular variable comes from global variable is dollar. If you observe, dollar is a special character, but this dollar, in front of dollar, we are appending /. If you use this dollar without /, then it considers as like this currency unit of entire text it is taking. Global variable product name is dollar. But if you append with the /, then currency unit of wine is dollar. So that means the global variable wine is stored under product name. Okay, and you're calling this global variable called product name, which brings the value wine, is /dollar. So if you miss the /, then it's not going to bring that particular variable value. If you use the /, then only this global variable value will be called. Okay, so that is very important. And then the next one is, you need to analyze and decide which selection method you want to parameterize the test object based on your requirement. What do you mean by that? So basically, if you want to use the selection method of XPath, or do you want to use the selection method of attributes, or do you want to use the selection method of CSS? So that you need to decide. You need to analyze and decide which selection method you want to use for parameterization of your test object. So this brings us to the end of our lesson.